I'd like to introduce your presentation around smallholder constraints and opportunities in vegetable value chains in the Philippines, and particularly a sustainable livelihood framework.
Okay, so firstly, I would like to share my experiences on working with smallholder farmers. And I'm sure many of you would have made these observations, but I would like to remind ourselves on some of the major challenges that we face when we talk about smallholder farmers. So the main barriers that we might be experiencing when we work with smallholder farmers is with respect to access to land, whether they have ownership to the land or they're working on a communal land or just able to lease land. So land itself becomes a big question for smallholder farmers. Access to technology is sometimes could be complex. Sometimes they don't get the right information during the right time. So these are additional challenges that smallholder farmers experience. Extension services. Now, in many of the developing countries, extension services is through the government, which is a public sector, and they are many times constrained of resources. So there may be a Department of Extension providing the services, but the services do not actually reach the smallholder farmers. Access to finance, that's another big question for smallholder farmers because they don't have assets. They are unable to access credit or financial institutions. Education, the literacy level being low in many contexts of the smallholder farmers, sometimes unable to go to school. Access to education is difficult, expensive, multiple reasons why the literacy level is low. And these are quite important factors to consider when we engage smallholder farmers in what mode they need to be engaged, in what mode they need to be provided information. These information is quite critical. In regards to participating in value chains, market information becomes critical. In some countries, market information and the market price is provided to smallholder farmers either through daily news, through newspapers, sometimes through mobile phones, and many times it doesn't reach the smallholder farmers. Time and labor constraints, mobility constraints, very low self-esteem. So I've observed that in a smallholder farmer context, the Department of Extension and sometimes even the research stations, they are located like in few meters away, but still smallholder farmers do not approach them to resolve their problems. And one of the reasons is they put themselves down and they consider that themselves very low in terms of really accessing these institutions. Remoteness and lack of transport, this becomes quite critical when you think about upgrading them in order to participate in the value chains. Socio-cultural barriers, norms and values. Sometimes smallholder farmers are unable to venture into some of the market segments, mainly due to these barriers. Lack of linkages with institutions in order to develop. So these are some of the barriers. I'm sure there are plenty, but let's look at how we need to understand the smallholder farmers in their context. Now, smallholder farmers have diversified source of income, and that's quite important and is very challenging. And sometimes when we focus on one particular factor of improving the production and just the value chains, because maybe that's not their priority. So they need to have a holistic view of where they are positioning themselves and where they think their income needs to be improved. Smallholder farmers are also constrained for resources, so understanding how to maximize utilizing those limited resources becomes critical. Smallholder farmers also lack linkages to institutions, as discussed earlier. So understanding the existing support functions is quite an important factor in order to facilitate them to participate in higher components of the value chains. Smallholder farmers' needs and aspirations may be very different from our views as people who come in to change their lives. So we need to understand what their needs are, what their aspirations are, so that we could relate to the livelihood outcomes that they are actually aiming at. Now, sustainable livelihood framework. So I would like to recall this framework was used for two projects. One is the ASEA project AGB 2012, which is the Vegetable Value Chains and Community Development Project. And currently there is a scale-out project, which is a small research activity on learning alliances to improve the vegetable value chains in the southern Philippines. And the second project is more focused just within Leyte. So these two ACAR funded projects gave me an opportunity to include or use this methodology or the framework on sustainable livelihoods. Now, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework is being introduced quite long back, but it's still being used as a very good framework in order to understand the context of livelihoods. And I'm currently also using the same framework to understand the gender gap with respect to the livelihood assets. So the earlier constraints that we were talking about actually relates to the livelihood assets. So the livelihood assets in the framework discusses mostly on the 5 capitals, which is the human capital, natural capital, financial capital, physical capital, and the social capital. There are additional capitals now in the literature, which includes the cultural capital and the political capital. But just for the basics, these 5 capitals are very important to understand the smallholder farmers' context. Now, as in the introductory session we discussed, the project was introduced in the southern Philippines, which experiences multiple typhoons. So the vulnerability context of the smallholder farmers was quite high, which means they experience high rainfall, high increased frequency of typhoons during the months of November to December, and this puts in the smallholder farmers in a very, very vulnerable position. In addition to this, there are other challenges, which is also puts the smallholder farmers in a vulnerable context, which includes the price trends and the seasonality of growing those crops. So all these challenges actually doesn't allow the smallholder farmers to increase or improve their livelihood so quickly. So in spite of having the livelihood assets, which is also limited, the resources also being limited, there are additional challenges to these smallholder farmers. The other segment of the framework talks about the structures, and the structures are related to the institutions, the policies that governs and influences the smallholder farmers with respect to access to all these livelihood assets. So these need to be also considered in the project in terms of understanding better the context of the smallholder farmers. And in a participatory process, when we discussed with the smallholder farmers, we understood their outcomes, what were their aspirations and outcomes of a livelihood, and that included more income, increased well-being, reducing their vulnerability, improved food security, and more sustainable use of natural resource base. Now, using the sustainable livelihood framework, the methods that were used was both quantitative and qualitative methods in the project. So household surveys was developed in order to quantify the livelihood assets with respect to those 5 capitals, and a qualitative method of focus group discussions was also used. Now, any method has its own limitations and challenges. So the quantitative method, of course, using surveys, which means you need to go through a previous literature in order to understand and frame those questions more clearly. So without prior information, conducting household surveys is going to be very, very challenging. So household surveys also is time consuming because you need to have enumerators for data collection process and also analyzing the data and finding solutions. So it's a quite lengthy process which involves time and resources. On the other hand, qualitative methods where you can use more open-ended questions and conduct focus group discussions. Although it could be a very quick method, the challenge is the capacity of the researchers in terms of facilitating focus group discussions, and using qualitative methods could also become a limitation. So based on the resources and the time and the capacity of the researchers, either methods or both methods could be used in order to understand the context of the farmers using the livelihood framework. Now we'll move on to the next slide, where I would like to introduce a bit more on the entry points and access and utilizations of these livelihood assets. Sorry, have to be on the previous slide. Okay, so the livelihood assets, access and utilization. So very, very carefully, we need to understand not just the existence of those assets, but how much of the assets are able to be accessed by the smallholder farmers and utilized is quite crucial for the project to actually decide what could be your entry points. So I'm talking about entry points, which means multiple entry points. You're not choosing one particular entry point, but then at the same time, it's going to be simultaneous as well. So again, going back to those 5 capitals, just want to expand a little bit on them. So the physical capital includes the infrastructure, access to technology, access to transport, etc. So you get an understanding of what the infrastructure available for the smallholder farmers, the technology, the mobile phone access and transport, etc. Financial capital, understanding the land holding, farm equipment, farm animals, savings and access to credit. Human capital is about the knowledge and skills of the person, which is acquired through training and experience. Social capital, the interpersonal ties and the intrapersonal ties and linkages that the smallholder farmers might have. The natural capital is more on the ecosystem services, which would include soil type, access to water, etc. It's not limited to this, but you could actually expand on this information in order to use these capitals to understand how smallholder farmers use them in order to manage their livelihood. Now, the entry point that I'm going to discuss here is multiple here. We understand what are the norms and values of the smallholder farmers. What is the intra-household dynamics, because we need to understand what the gender roles are and who does what in production and in value chain, and understanding the intra-value chain dynamics as well. So do they have a kind of a commitment to the trader? Do they kind of get the inputs on loan? And what is that linkage that's already built in, and what interventions would allow the smallholder farmers to manage their current situation? What capacity is required for all actors, including private sector? So there could be a private sector that might be willing to actually support smallholder farmers, provided they do this. These things need to be understood through the project. And of course, access and control of resources as well. So this gives an idea of how and what opportunities are available in terms of entry points for projects by using this livelihood framework. Now I'd like to introduce the case study of CALCOA, which is Cabintan Livelihood Community Association. CALCOA is situated in Cabintan, and it's located at the northeastern part of the Ormoc City, Leyte province in the Philippines, in the southern Philippines. It's distance at about 21 kilometers from the city of Ormoc. Its topography is slightly sloped and has got 277 hectares. What was significant is once we visited Cabintan during our first trip, we did understand that it is a reserve area, which means there was a private company called Energy Development Corporation, which actually is a company which is producing energy, but at the same time supporting the farmer associations for alternate livelihood. They did not want the smallholder farmers to go into the reserve forest and start deforesting, and they kind of introduced and supported the smallholder farmers in order to build an association where they can support each other in order to improve their livelihood. So this Energy Development Corporation, as a private sector, played a very important role in the project. And in terms of the soil characteristic, the soil was sandy loam with a pH range of 3 to 5, high rainfall and typhoons. As we mentioned earlier, during the months of November to February, which makes the vegetable growing very, very difficult during these months. And there's been heavy rainfall during different peak periods from the months of August. And protective cropping practice was considered very important intervention in order to improve the livelihood through vegetable production. So, as we understand the financial capital, the asset endowments of CALCOA was very important. So they had multiple protected structures, different types of them, small tunnels, big structures, and there was around 20 to 23 tunnels in place, which was owned by the farmer association. In spite of having the tunnels, before the project, the farmer association did not engage in production of any high value crops. So they were growing the usual crops like some of the tomatoes, beans, and cabbage. So these were the usual crops that they were growing, and they never thought about actually growing any high value crops. They did not have a proper irrigation system. So these were the points that the project took in order to make an impact. So a drip irrigation system was introduced in the project, and developing a proper cropping calendar to maximize the benefits from the protected structures. So they have a good structure, but in order to improve their livelihood, there should be a regular crop that needs to be planned to be grown under those structures based on the market demand. So this is where the project allowed to engage and facilitate the farmer association to understand that there needs to be a crop calendar developed based on the market demand, so that they could use the opportunity to participate in the value chain. So this is a photograph of the production protocol that was developed in a participatory process with the smallholder farmers, which means they were provided the information about the markets, and based on that, there was a cropping calendar developed. So there was capsicum, lettuce, tomatoes, which were high value crops, tomatoes basically for salad purposes. So this cropping calendar was developed with the farmers in a participatory process. Now moving on to the human capital. So there was training needs assessment conducted in a participatory way to help the farmers identify where they actually needed training. And one thing I would like to share with all the participants here. The training needs assessment is crucial, and I find this quite commonly used in many projects, but I would like to remind everyone that what farmers don't know is not what will get mentioned. So we need to understand to actually introduce the point where there might be training needs which they think are important, but at the same time there could be market requirements which may not get mentioned by the farmers as well. So that needs to be carefully weighed and introduced to the farmers. So capacity building of farmers, record keeping, and this is quite significant, and you would see and experience that this is not happening with smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers do not have practice of keeping the records, and this was quite important for this farmer association because of transparency, because when you're dealing with collective action, you need to understand where the money is being spent, how that will be divided, what would be the profit in case if there's a loss, how that will be managed. And the other important factor that the farmer association, which did not practice before, is practicing currently, is to actually reinvest in business. This is not a common practice. In our observation and experience in the project, all smallholder farmers, or many of the smallholder farmers that we engaged in the project, were waiting for seeds to be given by the city agriculture, or waiting for some support to actually happen. But through the project intervention and these systematic interventions, we supported the farmer association to actually think about how they can manage and govern their farmer association. So this is a synopsis of showing how the before and after in terms of production, which is the human capital that I'm talking about. So the seedling was actually produced, you can see on the ground, and then now there's nursery trays being used. And the before and after in terms of practices of post-harvest, you could see that's been done in bags, baskets, now moved on to actually plastic trays. Moving on to the social capital. The social capital associated with the farmer association was about the governance of the farmer association and building linkages. So regular meetings and feedback in order to develop the interpersonal ties, and building linkages with the other institutions like the city agriculture and local government unit was facilitated through the project, and specifically the market linkages. So you could see below a photograph where the farmers are showcasing the produce to the buyers, and this was facilitated through the project. So the buyers were invited and other market players to Cabintan in order to see the produce and actually be convinced in order to support the farmers when they want to sell the produce. So choice of crops based on market demand. So formulation of planting calendar with the farmers based from the market commitment of the traders. So once this market linkages was developed based on the market demand, the farmer association was facilitated in order to plan and revise their calendar. So you can see here the main crops were bell pepper and lettuce was in higher demand from the farmer association. And you could see some of the commitment forms that were signed by the traders. The other important intervention was registration of the farmer association with the BAR in order to manage their invoices and receipts, which made the farmer association to increase their self-esteem. Also, the social capital of the project in terms of linking with the Agriculture Training Institute, the ATI, then the Agriculture Training Institute accredited the Farmer Association as a learning site, And then engagement of the youth was through the high school immersion program of CALCOA. So the social capital was actually improved and by means of engagement and linkages. So the interpersonal and the intrapersonal ties was actually developed further. So you can see here the transportation of the vegetable to the Cebu market. So the physical capital being addressed here in terms of supporting the smallholder farmers. And transportation of the vegetables from the production area to the port for the Cebu market outlet. And walking the farmers along the market chain. So it's very important for the farmers to learn where their produce is going, because mostly before the project intervention, the buyers used to come there and then the farmers would actually basically get rid of their produce. And since then they would not know where the produce actually gone. But by means of walking the farmers along the market chain, they made observations and understood who their competitors are and where the produce actually goes. And that provides insights to the smallholder farmers in order to make their decisions. Feedback from the traders was a very important practice. So the smallholder farmers do understand that once they give the produce, it doesn't finish there. They need to understand and improve their production and the post-harvest techniques in order to meet the demands. Also, here is the supermarket, where the smallholder farmer leader of the Farmer Association discusses and observes what price CALCOA was receiving with respect to the competitor. Now, to wind up, impact on the community and livelihood outcomes. So there was an economic impact, which was increase in yield and income. The Farmer Association, after going through gender mainstreaming, did understand women's role and recognized women's role in Farmer Association and decision making. Increased knowledge skills on production, which means using high value crops, producing high value crops, and irrigation and maintaining the structures was quite important. Acquiring physical structure from open field to productive cropping was a significant change, and participatory decision making for collective action is very important. For any project, there's a time frame. So once our project finishes, what happens to all these interventions? So there was exit plans with the Farmer Association in terms of liaising the Farmer Association with the local government unit, the Agriculture Training Institute, and currently the Farmer Association is also participating in another ACR project where they are moving towards good agriculture practices and certification. They also have linkages with the district agriculture and the city agriculture. They have linkages and liaise with the Visayas State University for improved production techniques, and they participate in the Visayas University farmer programs. And also they plan projects at Cabintan beyond the life of the ACR project. So that project was very successful in terms of engaging the smallholder farmers to support the smallholder farmers to participate in the value chains. And I would like everyone to thank everyone for this opportunity. Thank you. Hello, Rod. I can't hear you.
Apologies, everybody. It's a problem for webinars, leaving your microphone on. Okay, I just wanted to say thank you, Gomathy, for your presentation. You've raised some really interesting and important points around livelihood assets and understanding the assets of farmers and the target groups, which I think are deserving and getting a lot more attention in terms of value, a part of value chain research and development in the last few years than they have in the past. I've got many questions, but there's been a good question submitted from Dom. So I'll start with there, and then we can come back to some other questions that I'd like to touch base on. Okay, so the question from Dom is, are there differences in the endowment of capitals for the poor versus better off farmers? And do these differences impact on their ability to join the association?
Yes, definitely it does. So there were some smallholder farmers who are better off in terms of their not in terms of the land access, but more in terms of their capacity to take leadership roles and be enthusiastic and motivated to be participators. So those are also equally important, not just the assets in terms of the physical or financial type of resources. It's more the personality and the venturesome of some of the farmers who actively started participating in the association. Yes, there was membership fees. There are monthly membership fees, but that's a very, very minimal fee that any smallholder farmer will be able to actually pay and become members. And there were situations where some smallholder farmers were unable to pay and still were members, continue to be the members of the association.
Yeah. So firstly, what you're saying is that there's quite a variability in the livelihood capitals and assets within the Cabintan group.
Yes.
And that entrepreneurship and drive and motivation was one of the key things that drove the individuals to join the group rather than their economic situation. Would that be
Exactly.
Is that fair enough?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
I just wanted to ask you, and this relates back to a question, and it's expanding a little bit from your direct presentation. I know in Ormoc you worked with at least 2 or 3 other groups, and can you just very quickly reflect on how Cabintan group compared to those other 2 or 3 groups in terms of their capital assets, in terms of how you would compare them in relative terms, and why Cabintan might have behaved differently to the other groups?
Okay, firstly, the Cabintan CALCOA group, there was extraordinary level of leadership within that farmer association, which actually supported the rest of the farmers and actually led the association to actively participate. The other farmer associations, I would like to compare these because we worked in 3 different provinces. So Leyte Farmer Association was CALCOA, but there was other farmer association, the other provinces did not have as much of private sector support as that of the Energy Development Corporation. So CALCOA stood out as a very, very successful farmer association compared to the other farmer association, which actually lack that support that any private sector would provide.
So you think that the involvement of EDC into that group, and I know that there was other development agencies, Israel Aid, providing technical support and other things, you think that was an important facilitator in their ability to kind of professionalize and link to the agribusiness market?
So there was because Ormoc is situated in a place where there's multiple typhoons. They had all these. That was a disadvantage, but the advantage was they attracted a lot of donor agencies, and so all these donor agencies started pouring in to provide support. But what the project did, and CALCOA also started learning from that, was to how do you actually facilitate and integrate all these resources that are coming in, and you maximize your benefit out of that. So that was a different experience for the CALCOA Farmer Association, where previously these challenges happened, but they came in and did what they wanted to do. But now CALCOA is actually saying guidelines on what they expect and where they need the support.
Yeah, right. Excellent. I mean, building on that, do you think that some of that donor support and intervention was a disincentive to some groups to be more independent, to be more entrepreneurial and business-like?
Not exactly disincentive, because the entrepreneurship did not come in through until they understood that there was market opportunities available. The private sector, where it supported, was the sophisticated infrastructure that could not have happened through any projects where you need massive funding for that infrastructure to be developed. But having that infrastructure did not allow them to participate in value chains, because they did not have the technical knowledge in order to actually utilize the infrastructure that they actually had.
Yeah. I'm just going to go to Dom's second part of the question, which is another very good part of this question is, are there different interventions that can be targeted at different farmer groups? Poor or better off, women or men, socially included or socially excluded? And I'm presuming this is depending on their livelihood asset context.
So it again comes, so this is where it gets complex, and you need to understand actually the needs and aspirations of the smallholder farmers that you're working with. So smallholder farmers is a very, very broad category, and there will be differences within the smallholder farmers themselves in terms of the assets that they may have access to and the aspirations that they might have. So if they do not want to participate in any economic improvement that they wanted, and their focus and their priority is different to the other smallholder farmers, then we should not be putting everybody in the same box. So that's what I'm trying to say when the entry points.
Yeah. So the needs then for those either groups or subgroups within a community, their needs may be different in terms of and part of whether it's community development approach or value chain, it's actually understanding what their needs are. It may not necessarily be upgrading their vegetable value chains. It might be something completely different.
Yeah, so that's one very important factor. But in the context of CALCOA Farmer Association, I can see that vegetables is their priority, and all farmer associations around that area still continue to have that as the priority for the livelihood. But in other contexts, it's more diversified. So maybe vegetables is not the priority, or that's not the where their interest is.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important points you've made this morning, Gomathy, around, when you started off with that, is about understanding their aspirations and need. And I think too often in the past, value chain research and development projects have gone in with a very narrow view, saying that, assuming that every farmer, every group needs to improve their productivity to link to a market, whereas that may not be the case.
And in addition to that, Rod, and another point that I mentioned is their relationship already, their existing relationship. So when you talk about participating in higher value chains, we need to not compromise their already existing relationship that they might have with the traders, which is beyond just a role of providing inputs, but it could be other factors that needs to be considered.
Yeah, look, absolutely. So I think that your application of the sustainable livelihood framework in this value chain context, I think, is very important. What's been your insights in going through this process within a project, working with other more traditional value chain and technical researchers? So, how would you do things differently in the future, and in terms of working together, bringing in these social livelihood aspects into value chain development and agribusiness development?
So one of the insights that I got through this project was understanding the interactions between those capitals, because earlier on when you start the research, it looked like those capitals are understood as separate, as what each capital actually influences, but it's so complex that each one of the capital influences the other, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And the other thing that I'm doing now differently in another project is understanding those capitals that are different with respect to genders. So the assets that within a household which a man can have may not be able to be accessed by a woman. So you need to have those understanding to actually understand about value chains and technical interventions.
Yeah, look, that's right. We have a good question here from Wawa in Myanmar. Thank you, Gomathy, for a very nice presentation. I would like to know that according to the project, do these farmers send their products to local supermarkets only, or could they access foreign/international markets? Could imagine that if there is a leading company for export, and if the farmers could link to and connect with that company, it would be better for farmers in terms of income, or just linking with local supermarkets would be better for farmers.
Okay, so we didn't think about exports. I don't think so that's even possible, because the volume that they produce within that particular association is the good quality gave a good price for the supermarkets, so that's why they chose supermarkets. But that's not the only channel where they sell the produce. They also sell to the various other buyers within Ormoc as well, which is like Greenwich Pizzas and other companies as well. So during each season, before the season, they do have a bit of a discussion with the buyers in order to know where the produce goes. But at the same time, when they start grading, they know where the A quality goes and where the B and C qualities go as well.
So, and for a bit of context, I guess before the project started, those farmers and that group basically just sold to lower quality, cheaper local markets, and really the project went through the process of upgrading to Cebu markets, which are mini export markets, because they have to, Ormoc and Cebu are on different islands, and they're a lot more sophisticated, aren't they? So the difference between the local markets and the Cebu market is very different.
Yes.
Similar to an export market in some ways.
Yeah. Not international market, but then it is a higher level of market as well.
Yeah, and Cebu, I think, is the second largest domestic market for fruit and vegetables in the Philippines, and so is a very large market where quality and consistency and those factors are really more higher priced. I'm just going to follow up on that question. One of the key observations from externally was the ability of the farmer group to start linking with those Cebu buyers and traders. And what was the role in the project around that linkage? Because it seemed that that was a key part of apart from the technical capacity building, things like that linkage to those buyers was a key part of that project. And just, I'd like you to reflect on that in terms of capitals and what the project is facilitated and how that was done. So
to begin with, the farmers we're producing the very normal, which is demand on the local market. So capsicum was totally a very new crop to them. There was no idea of producing capsicum, but the altitude, when we talk about, and the climatic conditions were all quite favorable, and there was a protected structure which is also suitable for a high value crop. Now, there was a market segment of this project which did market analysis, which means the whole research team went to the different markets, including Cebu, Tacloban, and Ormoc, and did a good study to understand what crops are of high price and that information was shared with the farmers in order to the decision-making process. So there was a decision-making process with the farmers before they actually switched on and said yes to actually start planting capsicum. So very, very importantly, the seeds. So the seeds is very expensive for capsicum. It's around 11 pesos. And that's not what the smallholder farmers wanted to invest in at the beginning, understanding the risks. And, you know, if there's a typhoon, everything is thrown out. But as they understood the market and the information and the trust and the rapport built with the team, they went into actually taking on the information to actually move towards high value crops.
Yeah. So yeah, that. And do you think the group had the social capital and the human capital to start with, to confidently interact with those buyers in Cebu, or was that something that had to be developed over time through support and mentoring, or their own development?
Definitely, yes. There was a series of meetings and discussions to be held with the Farmer Association in terms of preparing themselves in order to meet with the market players who were coming to Cabintan to visit and showcasing their produce. So that's one of the reasons we did not take them to the Cebu market, which will throw them off in order to look at the volume and the bigger market and the challenges. But we brought the market players to visit Cabintan in order to see what they produce, and that made the farmers more confident and comfortable in terms of interacting with the market players, because it was in their own comfort zone.
Yeah, understand. That's excellent. And how has that relationship between the group and the buyers developed over time, you know, since the project kind of has ended? Has that been sustained and grown? Has it leveled off, or has it declined? What's the kind of dynamics been over time with buyers?
So my understanding during my recent visit, it is sustained and grown. So they still continue to produce capsicum and the high value crops to those markets. And also it has been diversified. I must say they have taken on an opportunity of trialing brown onions and selling it to llama. So it's actually growing.
Yeah, excellent. No, I'm going to ask you about the framework itself, the Livelihoods framework, as a diagnostic tool. And I guess this is a reflection. So from the work you've done here and other places, can you use the approach looking at assets as a diagnostic tool to assess a community or a group or people within that, to say, okay, what's the suitability for value chain development of a certain value chain? Because often projects come in looking at a particular sector or a particular focus, and does the livelihood framework have a kind of diagnostic capacity to help in that?
It certainly does, Rod. It allows the researchers to understand what is available within the community and what they can access and to what segment they can participate. So instead of deciding what market chain the smallholder farmers need to participate before understanding or conducting this diagnostic development, I think so it's a bit of a danger, because then you cannot sustain as the project finishes, because you've just boosted them to participate in a particular segment, but then once you leave, it stops.
Yeah, and often projects are designed, around a certain crop or a commodity from a top-down focus, whereas you might be dealing with a community that has different aspirations, goals, and capabilities from a bottom up. So I guess there could be some tension within that. So how would you deal with that from a project design and development kind of viewpoint?
That's a very
the difficult question.
it's a very challenging question, because that's what's still being practiced in some funding organizations. So I would say that if you're looking at sustainability, that's a no doing of pre-assumptions on saying this is what would improve your livelihood. You might be able to showcase something temporarily, but then at the longer scale, that's not going to work. But if you can demonstrate that this is an alternate livelihood. So for instance, when we introduced capsicum, they definitely said no. But you come with some justification on saying the market demands this, you have the capacity to produce this, then you can move from whatever crop you were doing to do this. Are you willing to do? So there is a change. I'm not saying that it's not there. You can make the change, but provided there is enough justification and it is accepted by the smallholder farmers.
Yeah. So it's what you're saying. It sounds like flexibility on terms of the donor side, but also from growers' side. But I think one of your key points was that they have smallholder farmers and have a range of priorities: food security, income diversification, reducing their vulnerability to external shocks, and so being able to either target those needs or identify the groups within a community that are interested in market development is probably a really important thing. And this tool the Livelihoods framework is a way of doing that. Yeah. Look, fascinating, Gomathy, and I think this is a really, like I said before, a really important part of a more broader view of value chain research, looking at community interactions. And I should say also that this was part of a project that presented a relatively new view and paradigm around the interaction between value chain development and community development, which I think is a really important kind of context that needs to be thought more about. Look, we might wrap up soon. If people have a final question to submit, please do. We'd love to get your questions. We have had a great discussion already. I've just sent the link to the feedback form for people that can to leave their feedback. But look, if there's no more questions that come in the next minute or two, Gomathy, I'd just like to say thank you for your webinar this morning and for your insights. I think we've said a couple of times, I think this is a really important part of value chain research and something that probably deserves more attention going forward. And I think your type of work integrating into technical and economic disciplines of value chain research is really important. But I'd like to ask you a couple of your final thoughts and insights to researchers considering using the Sustainable Livelihoods framework in value chain development. So we'd be keen to get some of your final insights and learnings around that.
Okay, so by using the livelihood framework, there's two ways to do it. If you have good funding and enough resources and time, using a quantitative method in order to understand the livelihood assets will be helpful. But at the same time, if you need to really inform, because sometimes you are in a multidisciplinary project and you need to actually give the right information at the right time to make the decision in order to progress. So in that context, I would really suggest using a qualitative method where you can grasp the asset and use it as a diagnostic tool to actually quickly inform the research team on saying, this is the current situation of the smallholder farmers, these are the needs and aspirations, and these could be the possible entry points. And the other challenge is to keep the community motivated, because some research and data analysis might take more than a year or so, and the communities cannot wait until you come with a good answer and introduce interventions. So it's quite likely to actually move towards qualitative method in order to bring in the basics, in order to allow the other team members to design interventions, but also have the quantitative information in order to make sure that there is more clearer decision-making process in terms of research evidences.
Yeah,